The royal family had gathered, expecting nothing more than a night of tradition-formal speeches, glittering chandeliers, and carefully staged unity. But what Catherine whispered across the table turned the evening into a storm that not even Queen Camilla saw coming. The dinner was meant to showcase stability. Dignitaries, lords, and family members sat poised beneath centuries-old grandeur, every detail crafted to project harmony. Yet beneath the polished marble of royal ceremony, tensions simmered unseen. What was meant to be a celebration became the stage for an eruption no protocol could contain. From the very start, unease lingered in the air. King Charles, frail and visibly weary, was present but diminished his forced smile, failing to hide his fragility. His illness was a shadow, cast across the room. William, seated at his father's side, carried himself with quiet firmness, each gesture revealing the role he was slowly stepping into. Princess Anne, sharp-eyed as ever, scanned the table, noticing details others ignored. But it was not Charles, nor William, who held the room's attention. It was Catherine. Her silence carried more weight than any speech. She smiled when spoken to, nodded politely at rehearsed compliments, but her laughter was hollow, her warmth absent. Anne noticed it, first leaning forward, as though trying to catch a glimpse of Catherine's thoughts. Even the guests, seasoned in royal pageantry, felt it, an invisible heaviness pressing down on her shoulders. The breaking point came during the toasts. As a senior minister rose to honor the king, Catherine lifted her glass, held it aloft and set it down without drinking. The sharp clink of crystal against oak echoed like a thunderclap. Conversation stuttered. All eyes turned to her. Her silence screamed louder than words. William glanced at her, his face caught between fear and recognition. This was not planned. Catherine was about to do something no one had expected, not even him. Her gaze lingered on his face, not with hesitation, but with resolve. Months of secrecy weighed on that look. Months of whispered talks behind closed doors. Months of carrying a truth she could no longer bury. The air thickened. Guests shifted nervously. Camilla narrowed her eyes, sensing a threat to the delicate balance she guarded so fiercely. Catherine's hands dropped into her lap, her breath measured. A storm was coming, and once unleashed, it could never be contained. For months, whispers had haunted the palace corridors. Early morning doctors, unexplained absences, excuses of fatigue and private matters. Publicly, her absence was downplayed with polished statements. But those familiar with royal life knew something deeper was unfolding. Behind Windsor's walls, secrets grew heavier each day. Catherine bore them in silence. She smiled when duty demanded it, waved from car windows when expected. But in the stillness of night, she carried a private grief only she and William truly knew. Palisades deflected with vague explanations, yet speculation raged through the tabloids, rumors of health concerns, marital strain, even tensions with Camilla. All false, yet all dangerous. Within those stone walls, Catherine feared betrayal, not only from the press, but from within the palace itself. She knew how quickly a family's private suffering could be twisted into spectacle. Still, she endured, urged by William to wait. The truth must be yours to reveal, he told her. But how long can silence last when the heart is breaking? The dinner had been staged to prove stability. Catherine chose it as her battlefield. Surrounded by those who doubted her strength, she resolved to transform sorrow into truth. And when she finally rose from her chair, trembling yet steady, every glass and fork froze mid-air. Her voice cut through the silence with just 5 words that detonated across the monarchy like thunder. I was pregnant again. The room collapsed into stillness. Polite laughter, clinking glasses, whispered chatter, everything vanished in an instant. Catherine's truth had broken the silence. Her voice was steady, her tone deliberate, but the weight behind her words landed like thunder. For years, Catherine had been the very embodiment of restraint, the royal figure who never faltered, who never revealed more than what tradition allowed. Yet here, at a table lined with power, history, and expectation, she chose to dismantle. That silence was a truth no one had anticipated. The reaction was immediate. Camilla's hand trembled as her wine glass tipped, spilling red across the polished oak. Her shock was too raw to disguise. To her, Catherine's words were not simply personal, they were a challenge. A reminder that the woman she had once dismissed as timid now wielded a power she could not control. Across the table, King Charles paled. His fragile health had already stirred whispers throughout the nation, and this revelation struck him like a physical blow. The thought of another heir, a piece of history hidden and suddenly unveiled, left him visibly shaken in front of his guests. Princess Anne, Catherine's quiet defender, was the first to break the frozen silence. She turned sharply to William, her piercing eyes searching for confirmation. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. This wasn't planned, wasn't approved, wasn't staged by the palace. It was raw, unleashed. William didn't meet her gaze. He didn't need to. The clenched jaw, the tightened grip on Catherine's hand, those gestures told the entire story. He had known. He had carried this secret with her, and together, in this moment, they had chosen to lay it bare. The guests shifted uneasily, leaning closer to one another with whispers of disbelief. This was not how things were done. Royal revelations were carefully choreographed by advisors, polished into statements, unveiled on the palace's terms. But Catherine had shattered all of it. In one moment, she had stripped away protocol, leaving the monarchy's courtiers powerless. What was meant to be a night of tradition had become a spectacle of vulnerability and rebellion. And yet Catherine remained unshaken. Her calm was almost chilling, forged by months of silent suffering. She did not falter. She did not cry. Her voice carried both the ache of loss and the fire of defiance. For too long, her truth had been hidden. Tonight, she reclaimed it no matter how deeply it cracked the palace facade. But what those seated at the table didn't yet realize was this: Catherine's revelation wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Her words were not simply confession. They were warning, a prelude to something far darker. For the nation believed Catherine was the mother of 3 heirs. But behind palace walls, there had been a fourth, a child whose story had never been told until now. Her voice, calm but weighted with sorrow, unveiled the truth even the press had failed to uncover. For years, the world had celebrated the picture of perfection. 3 children, symbols of stability and hope. But the truth was far more fragile. Catherine had carried a 4th life, a child who never stood beside the others. A child whose existence had been erased by silence before it could ever be embraced by the nation. The weight of that revelation pressed down on every heart in the room. What she shared was not scandal, it was grief. The kind of grief no palace could spin or disguise. She spoke of hidden suffering, nights spent alone, smiles forced for cameras, the unbearable burden of mourning, while the world demanded perfection behind the sparkle of gowns and tiaras. Catherine had concealed heartbreak. That mask cracked tonight, William's anguish was etched in every breath. He had been torn between the duty of silence and the agony of watching his wife suffer in shadows. Behind closed doors, he held her as she wept tonally to stand firm in public, bearing the weight of both his people's expectations and her private pain. For him, her truth was not just confession, it was release. A moment when heartbreak was finally brought into light. The press had missed it. The palace had buried it. But Catherine's words undid years of silence with a truth so human it shattered the illusion of control. Around the table, guests sat, frozen, many reduced to tears. It wasn't scandal they heard. It was resilience. Her strength lay not in concealment, but in daring to reveal what the monarchy never wanted exposed. And yet her confession was more than grief. It was defiance. For months, whispers had circled. Camilla's circle had dismissed Catherine's absences as fragile nerves, mocking her strength. Rumors painted her as too delicate, too weak for the crown. Catherine endured them in silence, and tonight, now, she struck back with the only weapon stronger than rumor. Her voice, her words reclaimed dignity. She was no longer the woman whispered about in corridors. She was no longer the consort dismissed as fragile. She was the force that shattered silence. Even Anne, seated near her, straightened with unspoken approval. That silent gesture carried weight and alliance, noticed by everyone at the table. But if Catherine's voice carried grace, William's burned with fury. When Camilla attempted to interject, when she dared dismiss Catherine's revelation as an untimely disruption, William's restraint finally broke. His words, sharp as steel, cut through the room. His defense of Catherine was more than loyalty. It was a declaration. Her truth would not be silenced, not be silenced. Not by Camilla, not by anyone. The future king had drawn his line, and by his side stood the woman who would one day reign. What had begun as a glittering royal dinner, silver goblets raised, chandeliers glowing like stars over velvet, had turned into something far darker. The atmosphere no longer belonged to speeches or toasts. It belonged to war. Not a war fought with armies, but with stares, with silences, with words sharper than any sword. It was a war of queens, unfolding before stunned guests who now sat, frozen, unsure whether to breathe or to watch history being rewritten in front of them. Every gesture was loaded. Every glance carried meaning. Camilla, rattled and furious, found herself pushed into the shadows by the sheer gravity of Catherine's revelation. For years, Camilla had maneuvered in those very shadows, whispering her influence through corridors and court dinners. But tonight, Catherine had lit a torch so bright that the shadows themselves seemed to shrink. The air thickened, heavy with something unspoken. This was no longer about sympathy or grief. Catherine had changed the balance of power with a single truth, a truth that redefined not just her role, but the monarchy itself. She was not merely mourning. She was declaring her revelation of loss, heartbreaking, raw, almost unbearable, had transformed into something larger than sorrow. It was a statement about the crown, about succession, about survival. For Catherine, silence had nearly cost the Windsor bloodline its certainty. By revealing what she had carried in secrecy, she stripped gossip of its power. She reminded every guest at that table that her children, and no one else's, were the true heirs to the throne. In Catherine's eyes, truth was not weakness, it was armor, it was necessity. She knew the monarchy too well. Every birth, every death, every title was not merely personal, but political. And in such a world, silence was not safety. It was a weapon. a weapon that others could turn against you. She would not allow that again. William's anger, long simmering in the shadows of whispers, now burned openly. For months he had endured the quiet audacity of courtiers who dared imagine that Camilla's blood, her grandson, an outsider, might one day inch closer to the throne than he deserved. To William, it was treachery dressed up as speculation. But Catherine's words had given him permission to turn his fury into something visible. His voice, his gaze, his very presence carved his defiance into the room. Catherine, however, was not fire, she was steel. Precision, not rage. Her grief was her weapon, but she wielded it with the calm of a surgeon, cutting through layers of pretense. By claiming her lost child's place in the narrative of succession, she fortified her family's legitimacy. She closed every door that might have been left open for Camilla to slip through. She turned her pain into a fortress around her children, an unbreachable wall of truth. Even Princess Anne, stoic and unsentimental, allowed herself a subtle nod in Catherine's direction. For Anne, who had lived her entire life in duty's shadow, recognition was not given easily. That nod was no small gesture. It was a quiet alliance, a silent judgment to everyone in the room. Catherine had spoken with the weight of history behind her. The atmosphere of the dinner changed entirely. No longer was it a royal pageant. It was now a declaration of legacy. Catherine had taken what was meant to wound her and shaped it into power. Grief had become strength. Silence had become rebellion. But the greatest shock was reserved for the king. As Catherine's truth rang across the hall, eyes turned to Charles. His silence was louder than thunder. His body, frail and weary, seemed to collapse inward, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as though to stop himself from crumbling. He had been the monarch expected to steady the family through turbulence. Yet here he sat, pale, trembling, paralyzed. For years he had tried to appear unshakable despite the shadows of illness. But tonight, every weakness was written across his face. His silence cracked the image of authority he had clung to. It was not strength the guests saw, it was surrender. A king who could not defend his wife, a father who could not contain his son, a monarch who could not hold together his dynasty. And then, like a ghost, Diana returned. Her name was never spoken, but her memory swept through the hall like a chill. Everyone remembered her pain, her silence, her lonely suffering. And now, as they watched Catherine defy that silence, history seemed to echo. The contrast was cruel. Where Diana had been silenced, Catherine stood unbroken. And against that memory, Charles looked smaller still. Camilla seethed beside him, her jaw tight, her breath sharp, silently demanding a defense that never came. Her fury grew with every second of his silence. Yet William's unflinching loyalty to Catherine left Charles torn in half, unable to choose, unable to move. His silence became his downfall. The monarchy's unity, once fragile, now appeared shattered before every witness in the room. And then Catherine struck the final blow, rising not with anger but with resolve. Her voice cut through the suffocating air. "I will no longer stay. Silent, no matter the cost." The words were simple, yet they fell like thunder, a blade slicing through centuries of decorum. A declaration that the old rules of secrecy and restraint no longer bound her. She was no longer merely the future queen consort, she was a force of her own. Her grief had become her shield, her weapon, her crown. In that moment, Catherine was unshakable. Every tear she had once hidden now gleamed as proof of her strength. Every sorrow became a warning. She could not, and would not, be silenced again. At her side, William clasped her hand. It was a small gesture, but in that room it was everything. A bond of steel, a vow unspoken yet undeniable. Where Charles faltered, where Camilla fumed, William and Catherine stood unbroken, a united front, a vision of monarchy reborn not through secrecy, but through truth. And the guests, stunned, breathless, shaken, knew they had witnessed more than a dinner. They had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter, one written not by the old king, but by the future, asterisk, asterisk, in unity. His silence was not submission, it was solidarity. In that single act, William made it clear that Catherine's truth was his truth, that her pain, her loss, her fight were his own. And in choosing not to speak, he spoke louder than any words ever could. The future king and his consort were no longer shadows standing in the background of a fragile monarchy. They were the undeniable center, the force that drew every gaze, every heartbeat in that room. And with Catherine's revelation, they were no longer simply heirs to tradition, they had become architects of the future. Camilla, however, refused to yield. She struck back with the only tools she knew: dismissal, ridicule, scorn. She tried to brand Catherine's courage as recklessness, her truth as ill-timed disruption, her grief as weakness. But the harder she pushed, the more transparent her desperation became. Every attempt to silence Catherine only echoed louder in the silence that followed. The room had already chosen its side. Every eye, every breath, every unspoken word leaned toward Catherine. Camilla's fury, her unraveling composure, stood in sharp contrast to Catherine's calm defiance. One was rattled, the other was immovable. And in that difference, the balance of power shifted forever. Then came a voice no one had expected. Princess Anne. Her words did not roar. They resonated, quiet, measured, but laced with the authority of a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and scars. She praised Catherine's courage, acknowledging that speaking truth in a palace built on silence required a strength few possessed. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for, the moment when an elder of the House of Windsor, the one who had carried duty without compromise, stood beside Catherine. And with that single act, Anne lent legitimacy to Catherine's defiance. The effect was immediate. Guests rose from their seats, their applause filling the hall in a thunderous breach of royal decorum. It was unthinkable open emotion, open defiance inside these walls. Yet no one held back. They clapped not for protocol, not for tradition, but for Catherine, the woman who had stood alone in grief and chosen, finally, to stand tall in truth. The palace walls had never heard such a sound. The echoes of that applause carried far beyond the gilded chamber. It was not simply noise, it was history. But Catherine knew, even as the applause washed over her, that this was not an ending. It was only the beginning, because the monarchy survives not in halls of gold, but in whispers. And already whispers had taken flight. As the doors closed on the dinner, the corridors of the palace filled with frantic footsteps. Courtiers rushed from chamber to chamber, their faces pale with shock, their voices trembling with urgency. Word of Catherine's confession spread like fire, unstoppable, untamable. And beyond the palace walls, the world was waiting. The headlines were ready. To ignite questions would flood every newsroom, every household. Speculation would tear through the kingdom like a storm. Catherine's truth, once guarded in silence, was now beyond her control. It belonged to history. Camilla, seething, moved swiftly. Already she schemed, desperate to seize control of the story before it slipped entirely from her grasp. But her fury, her plotting, was overshadowed by the image of Charles, confined to his bed, his frailty exposed. The storm was too great for him to endure, and so, in the vacuum left behind, only William and Catherine remained. Their unity, tested by sorrow, sharpened by truth, had become the monarchy's only lifeline. Asterisk, asterisk. And in the shadows of that night, the secret of the fourth child ceased to be a hidden grief. It became a symbol of loss endured, of resilience reborn, of defiance unchained. Catherine's revelation was no longer just about the past. It had become a blueprint for the monarchy's future, a future written not in silence and obedience, but in courage, sacrifice, and truth. The applause had faded, the candles had burned low, the palace had returned to its familiar quiet, but nothing would ever be the same again, because that night, in a single act of defiance, Catherine did more than speak her truth. She rewrote the destiny of the crown, no matter the cost. Asterisk. The morning after the storm, the palace awoke to chaos. What had begun as whispers in gilded corridors became front-page headlines. Catherine's secret revealed. The fourth child of the crown. Newspapers screamed. Television anchors spoke with trembling urgency. Social media erupted into wildfire speculation. For the first time in decades, the monarchy's carefully controlled silence was shattered not by scandal, but by raw human truth. Outside the palace gates, cameras crowded the streets. Crowds gathered, not to jeer, but to wait for Catherine, for William, for answers. They no longer looked at her as a princess bound by protocol. They saw her as a mother, a woman of courage, a figure willing to bleed before the world rather than hide in shadows. But within the palace walls, another storm raged. Camilla. Her fury was boundless. She convened private meetings, demanded statements be drafted, pressured loyal courtiers to act. She called Catherine reckless, accused her of dragging the monarchy into the mud. Yet the more she fought, the more the narrative slipped from her. Grasp, the world was no longer listening to Camilla. They were listening to Catherine, and Charles, frail, confined, unable to command, was silent. His absence left a void that could not be filled by anger nor by denial. The monarchy needed leadership, and suddenly all eyes turned toward William and Catherine. For the couple, the days that followed were a test of fire. Every headline questioned them. Every camera chased them. Every whispered conversation inside the palace carried daggers behind polite smiles. Yet they did not falter. Catherine, who had once carried her grief in silence, now carried herself with unshakable resolve. And beside her, William stood firm, not as a prince behind his father's throne, but as the king the people already saw in him. But the true shift came not from the press, nor from courtiers. It came from the people, across the nation. Letters poured in by the thousands, flowers piled at palace gates. Crowds chanted Catherine's name. They weren't celebrating scandal. They were honoring courage. They were demanding a new kind of monarchy, one not built on silence and shadows, but on truth and humanity. For Camilla, it was the final blow. Her efforts to discredit Catherine dissolved under the weight of public devotion. Where she looked desperate, Catherine looked dignified. Where she seethed with bitterness, Catherine shone with resilience. The contrast was undeniable, and then, quietly, a decision was made. The palace announced that the king, citing his health, would step back indefinitely from public duties, and in his place, the responsibilities of the crown would pass not to Camilla, but to William and Catherine. It was not a coronation. It was not ceremony. It was something more powerful, a recognition that the monarchy had already shifted. In the hearts of the people, the crown had found its future. That night, as William and Catherine stood side by side on the palace balcony, the crowd below roared not with forced applause, but with genuine devotion. Catherine did not wave like a distant figurehead. She looked out at the sea of faces, her own steady, unflinching. In her eyes was grief, yes, but also fire. A fire that had carried her through silence, through sorrow, through defiance. And in that moment, the monarchy felt reborn. The secret of the fourth child was no longer just a wound carried in shadows. It had become a story of endurance, of truth, breaking chains of a future forged from pain. Camilla, isolated, faded into the background she had once forced upon Catherine. Charles, confined, became a silent witness to the inevitable. But William and Catherine stood in the light, not as heirs, waiting, not as figures in the margins, but as the unshakable force guiding the crown into its next chapter. History will remember that night as the turning point, the night when silence ended, when truth rose, when Catherine, once dismissed as fragile, proved unbreakable. And though the cost was heavy, though the scars would remain, the monarchy had been reshaped forever, because courage is contagious, and in Catherine's defiance, a kingdom found its future.